All right, well, I'm going to get things started here. So welcome to the Wisconsin Farmers Union video premiere and town hall to fight back against monopoly power. My name is Sarah Lloyd. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the organization, but importantly, I'm a member. So my husband and I dairy farm with his family just outside Wisconsin Dells in Columbia County. And we're members because we know that Wisconsin can have an economy that supports family farmers and vibrant communities and also cares for the land. But we need to fight right now because farmers are going broke. Wisconsin rural communities are becoming economic deserts, and we're losing the vitality and vibrancy of our farms and our communities. In this time of the COVID pandemic, we've seen so clearly how brittle our current agriculture and food system economy is. We see firsthand the disruptions. Actually, just this past week, our neighbors down the road had to dump milk. And we know that consumers are in the stores and seeing empty dairy cases. And just today, we heard about more meat processing plants closing down. So we know that things aren't working. One of the reasons that farmers like us are going broke and our economy is so fragile is that increasing consolidation and monopoly power have a stranglehold on our farmers and our communities. But this didn't just happen all by itself. Weak politicians and greedy agribusiness and banking leaders have not had the backbone to stand up for family farms and rural communities. They have not limited monopoly power in the economy. Instead, they just want farmers running faster and faster on the treadmill to line their own pockets. But that's why we're here tonight. We're coming together to get riled up about the issue, to learn about the situation. So I welcome you to the fight. I welcome you to our video premiere and town hall. I just want to do some housekeeping. So after the video, I will introduce our special guest, Dr. Jennifer Clapp, who will share her insight and expertise on the issue of monopoly power. We'll have time then for question and answers from all of you in attendance. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a spot marked Q&A. So you can click there and type questions in the box. And we are recording this event. So you'll be able to watch it again. You can share the link, which we'll share with you afterwards. We invite you and ask you to share it with your friends and family and neighbors. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass the mic to Tommy, who will kick off our video premiere.
Hi everyone, I'm Tommy Enright. I'm the Communications and Special Projects Associate here at Wisconsin Farmers Union, and I kind of oversaw the production of this video. We're really excited to premiere this for you tonight. It is featuring 3 Wisconsin Farmers Union members, Kevin Mahalko, Orrin Jacobson, and Joel Keenhold. And I also want to give a special shout out to Stevens Point Area Co-op, who allowed us to do some filming there as well. We did not give them scripts or anything. We just got in touch with these members, and we wanted to hear what they had to say about how monopoly power, how concentration and consolidation are affecting them. So these are real member voices, and that's something that we hold near and dear to us here at Wisconsin Farmers Union. Actually, if you go to our website, there's a link on our homepage saying seeking member voices, because we want to hear from you. So if you have something to say about rural healthcare, climate change, commodities, how COVID-19 is affecting you, we want to share your story, because that's how we raise awareness. That's how we make change. So with that, I will start the video. I'm just going to go to a screen share here and we'll kick it off. And just to get this out there, if we have any technical difficulties here, I realize a lot of people are on rural internet, or I'm on rural internet, but mine's pretty decent. We will be sharing this video far and wide. It should be on our YouTube channel. I'll be sending it out to all the participants tomorrow morning. So There will be more opportunities to see not only this video, but the full webinar that we're doing today. So here we go. And
my earliest memories are of being on the farm and working with my parents, my uncles. It was just always really fun to get out there with the cows, with the tractors, and it's just always been a goal and passion. Years ago, there were multiple buyers looking for milk. So you'd have co-ops, you'd have private buyers, you'd have a cheese factory, and there was never a question that you could sell your milk.
Vertical integration started happening in the 60s. We saw that first in poultry, then we saw it happen in pork, and now we're seeing it happen in dairy. And dairy held out for a long time because of the sheer number in Wisconsin of independent dairy farmers and independent cheese factories and milk processing plants.
If you can understand and appreciate diversification of your stock portfolio, then you should understand that if you are in the food business, that the best of all possible scenarios for you is that you have many customers and that you have many suppliers. Because as soon as you have only a couple suppliers, then you're at their beck and call and they control you. And as soon as you have only a few customers, then you're at their beck and call and they control you and they set the price.
Wisconsin Farmers Union and its members are really concerned about the influence of economic power in the United States and how the rise of monopolies and the concentration and consolidation that's occurring in the agriculture sector is really hurting independent farmers and destroying rural communities. Our goal here is to capture how issues like monopolies and multinational corporations are really influencing real people in rural America.
So you can't just be an outright abusive monopoly. And so the practices today are disguised. They're disguised in language that makes it seem like the activity is pro-competitive and promotes a lower price and relies upon economy of scale.
If you really lock into like say a dairy contract where you're talking about tanker loads of milk, the bankers will start to control like what size of a herd you need, how much milk you need to produce, and I've just seen where some farmers have just gotten into a spiral of making a lot of decisions based on what the bankers tell them is their proper herd size versus what might be more appropriate for the landscape.
We've lost thousands and thousands of farms with the same pattern is occurring. It's not about a farmer who may or may not have the economic or the financial wherewithal to manage their business. It's far beyond that. It's because there are structural forces that are creating an unfair market for them to operate in.
At every step of the way, if someone can come in overcapitalized and overproduce for some period of time using classic business practices that have driven out smaller producers and consolidated other industries, then the small farm is never going to be able to outgrow that.
People are going under 800 farms in a year. That's not reasonable at all. And that's an indicator of our economy in general. You know, outside of agriculture, this is going to keep going.
One of the things that to me is a tragedy is when I see, a neighbor go out of business, and we just lose so much because of market forces, getting too low of a price for too long. They ultimately lose a way of life.
Farming is emotional. It's part of you. It's part of who you are and your identity, so it's not that easy to give it up. And that's why we need to be concerned about mental health of our farmers right now, because they are not seeing another option to go into or another direction to take their business because it's impossible to break into markets.
if we look at risk and we say that there's risk inherent in producing food, then if we put all our food in one basket, then we've consolidated that risk. And so in the inevitable moment when there's a problem, that problem is now multiplied by the scale of that consolidation.
Before you purchase things, ask the question, whose interests are served? One of the easiest roads for people to go is just to buy direct from a farmer. That's going right into their pocket and cutting out any middlemen.
I think that our agricultural economy is not necessarily going to collapse, but it's definitely going to change. And we can go one of two ways. We can empty the landscape of all independent farmers. And this is a projection that, like, within 20 years, Wisconsin might only have like 4 dairy farms.
You know, right now in the state of Wisconsin, the Attorney General's office doesn't really look at Wisconsin-based antitrust. They sign on to federal cases predominantly. Why aren't the empowered district attorneys in every single county using their office and their power to address these disparities and consolidation in their own county?
Farmers are a pretty independent bunch, and so I can't believe that we would allow this to happen, but it seems that we have through not working cooperatively. That mindset, that mentality has to stop, it has to reverse. We need to support each other and bring each other up and know that there are places for every kind of agriculture, except for giant mega farms, which has no place at all.
Great. Well, thank you, Tommy, and all the farmers, and to Julie Bomar for working on this video. We hope that the quality worked well for your rural internet. As Tommy mentioned before, this video is up on our YouTube channel. We'll be sharing the link with you, as well as the link for the full recording of this webinar. We're going to move on to the next part of why we're here tonight. We're gathered here because we are Farmers Union members. We care about food. We care about our neighbors. We care about our farms. One of the founding credos of the Farmers Union is the phrase, "Let us reason together." So we decided to pair the video premiere with some reason. And we want to learn about these issues and how things are structured so that we know how we can make positive change for our farms and communities. So I'm going to introduce our special guest here tonight. Professor Jennifer Clapp is an award-winning scholar. She's a Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. We won't hold that against her here in Wisconsin. She has a master's and a PhD in international political economy from the London School of Economics. She has focused her research on global governance problems that arise out of the intersection of the global economy, the environment, and food security. She has numerous books and articles. Her most recent book is co-authored with S. Ryan Isaacson, and it's called Speculative Harvests, Financialization, Food, and Agriculture. She's a really perfect guest for us tonight. She focuses on financialization in the global food system and looking at impacts on global food security and sustainability. So I am going to pass the mic over to Dr. Jennifer Clapp. She's going to share her screen, and she's going to talk for about 12 minutes, share some slides, and then we'll open it up for Q&A using the Q&A box. So thank you, Dr. Clapp, for being with us today.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and it's really an honor to be here. I'm happy to be speaking about issues of corporate power in the food system alongside the wonderful film that was just screened. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen. I do have a few slides I'd like to show. And just to say, I'm in the midst right now of a research project that's looking at the rise of what I call mega companies in the global food system. And so what I'd like to present is a bit of an overview of some of the ideas that I've been working on with respect to looking at corporate power in the food system. And to meet my 12 minutes, I'm just going to jump right in. And I want to focus my comments tonight around three big questions, trying to give some context, bigger context to the issues we just learned about in the film. So to begin, I'd like to talk about the state of corporate dominance in the agri-food system today. And to begin with, it's important to note that the global economy has been undergoing a period of heightened corporate consolidation and mergers and acquisitions more generally over the past decade. And this has given rise to some truly massive firms that dominate across a number of key sectors. We've seen trillions of dollars of mergers and acquisitions occurring every year in the past 5 years. And food and agriculture firms are, as the slide here shows, they're among the biggest of some of these deals, many of which are over $100 billion in value. Now, concentration and consolidation in the agri-food system was already a problem, but these mergers are making it more pronounced. Already at different points along agri-food supply chains, we have just a handful of firms that tend to dominate a big chunk of the market. And so with recent merger deals, for example, the deals in the seeds and chemicals sector that occurred over the 2015 to 2018 period that saw Bayer swallow Monsanto, Dow and DuPont merged, ChemChina bought Syngenta, and BASF stood ready to buy everything that everyone else was trying to sell. We ended up going from 6 big companies that controlled that sector just down to 4. And it's a similar story at other points in the agri-food supply chains, from fertilizers to farm machinery to agricultural production, processing, packaging, and retail. So the basic point here is that we're seeing an increase in that consolidation that has already been a problem. And that's part of this bigger trend in the global economy. So I'd like to talk secondly about why corporate concentration is intensifying in the sector, in particular at this moment in time. And there's a couple of reasons. The first is about technological change and intellectual property protection. This plays a big role in a lot of the mergers and acquisitions in the sector. Research and development for technological innovation is expensive, and technologies are constantly changing. And firms, these big corporations, they're often trying to join forces through a merger or an acquisition in order to gain enough capital so that they can engage in this expensive research and development. And also they're often looking to purchase other companies that might have patents in areas that give intellectual property protection in areas that they're trying to move into. And so it's a bit of a exercise with these firms are just trying to get bigger in order to position themselves in a rapidly changing technological environment. And we're also seeing technologies linking up from different parts of the sector. And often this is in a kind of vertical integration that was mentioned in the film, where different stages within the supply chain tend to get linked up. And we've seen this in the agriculture sector in particular. If we look at the input sector, for example, with seeds and chemicals, that's really a really strong example of these linking up of technologies and the need for firms to get bigger in order to engage in this kind of research and development. So since the 1990s, for example, we've seen a number of mergers and acquisitions in the seed and chemical sector, where big seed companies were buying ag biotech startups in order to acquire their research capacity, their patents, and then they were actually merging with the chemical companies because they were developing genetically modified seeds that were designed to work with specific chemicals. So again, this kind of like integration technologically, bringing these firms together. And the latest trend that we're seeing right now is this digitalization in the agri-food space, where we're seeing the rise of digital farming, as well as the use of computer-generated genome mapping for gene editing. And it's in this space that we're seeing now a kind of a movement to bring together input companies with information systems and even with farm equipment companies, moving towards greater integration. So that's the first big reason why we're seeing these mergers heating up at this particular moment in time. But there are a couple of other reasons that I think are important to mention. One of them is what scholars call the financialization of agricultural investment. And what this is referring to is the prioritization of financial values and financial motives in driving decisions in the sector. And so what we're seeing here in this case is that in recent decades, we've seen the emergence of new financial interests in the sector because there are new financial instruments available to investors. In other words, there are all kinds of investment funds that are enabling investors to get a foothold in the agricultural sector in order to try and make a profit. So these kind of new instruments are attracting investors, like institutional investors in particular, like hedge funds, pension funds, and asset management companies that are holding huge numbers of shares in some of the biggest companies in the sector. And this is something I've done research on in the past year or so, and it's fascinating because in particular, the graph that I've got on the screen here shows that some of the biggest asset management companies, and these are the companies like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, and Capital Group. You might recognize them because they sell all kinds of investment products for retirement savings, for example. But it's increasingly, when you look at who and what they own around 15 to 30% of the shares of almost every company in the Standard & Poor's 500, and that includes the big food companies that you can see on the screen here. So what happens in this situation is when these companies have a huge proportion of their shares being owned by financial companies, those companies can push these firms to increase their profits. And one of the ways that they're pushed to increase their profits is actually to engage in mergers and acquisitions in order to expand their market share and increase prices. And this has been a really changing the sector in a big way, because these financial motives are really pushing these mergers in an interesting way. And because we've had low interest rates since the last financial crisis, it's been really easy for corporations to borrow large sums of money in order to buy up their rivals and become bigger companies. So that's the second big reason why this is happening now and why it's becoming more intensified. And the third reason that I wanted to touch on is simply this relaxation or weakening of antitrust law and policy in recent decades. Since the 1980s in particular, we've seen a loosening of the way in which antitrust policies have been interpreted and applied, especially in the US. Since the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the US has had fairly strong antitrust policies that were brought in to protect small-scale businesses and to curtail the power of big, giant firms. Louis Brandeis, who's shown on the screen here and who was quoted at the end of the film, he was a key advocate for antitrust in the early 20th century, and he helped enact laws that ensured a fair market structure. In other words, he argued that markets need to be structured fairly in order to protect producers, entrepreneurs, workers, and citizens. And so in a sense, antitrust was about protecting those who were the businesses in the sector. But by the 1970s and 80s, things started to change. And this was with the rise of what we call neoliberalism, or this free market ideology that really took off in the Reagan era. And a different approach to antitrust was promoted by another scholar and policymaker, Robert Bork, who you might know, he's famous for all kinds of reasons, which I don't have time to get into, but maybe in question period. But he wrote a really important book, and it was coming out of the sort of Chicago school of economic thinkers, and arguing that we need to prioritize efficiency in antitrust rather than market structure. So what he was arguing is that if prices, it's okay if corporations get big so long as prices go down. That was the basic gist of what he was saying, because he was saying that would benefit consumers. And because this was an era of free market ideology, and he was trying to get the government out of regulating market structures, this idea really took off, and it really reshaped how antitrust policy was implemented in the US. And it meant that the Department of Justice, which oversees these antitrust laws, became a bit more lax and let more companies merge on because the firms were promising that they needed to get bigger, to get economies of scale in order to bring prices down. So this sort of led to less, fair market structure, let's say, in the name of trying to be more efficient. So these big changes, this sort of technological change in intellectual property protection, this rise of financialization, and the weakening of antitrust law and policy have really been important forces that have been responsible for a lot of the consolidations that's happened across the sector, including in food and agriculture. Now, I'd like to shift to talk about some of the implications. There are many implications. They are all interrelated. And the implications that I want to talk about here really resonate with what the farmers were saying in the film just now. One of the key implications of this corporate consolidation is that it tends to weaken competition and crowd out smaller enterprises. When economists try to look at a sector and measure whether or not it's competitive, they tend to look at a measure called the CR4, and that's simply the market share of the top 4 firms in the marketplace. And their benchmark is typically, if the market concentration of the top 4 firms is 40% or less, it's considered competitive. But if the market concentration is above 40%, and especially if it's above 60%, it's considered to be uncompetitive. And you can see here, I pulled out some of the data for different parts of the US farm sector: beef processing, pork, soybean crushing, corn milling, et cetera. And you can see those concentration ratios are very high. So in short, it's signaling that this is these are uncompetitive markets because they're dominated by a few market players. And that basically crowds out smaller enterprises from being able to enter the market. A second implication I want to touch on is that corporate concentration, and extreme concentration in particular, has been associated in the research more generally with a dampening of incentives for innovation. And it's really interesting when we look at the food and agriculture sector. One area I've been looking at in writing a recent paper in particular was the way in which corporate concentration has affected the input companies' innovation around herbicides. And what we see here is extremely interesting. And I'm sure you're all aware of the rising use of glyphosate in farming, because so many crops are genetically modified and they're designed to work with glyphosate, and glyphosate is used in many other technologies as well. But we've also seen a rise in glyphosate resistant weeds that are really difficult to tackle without reaching towards more toxic and older chemicals. But the important point to note here is that there have been no new active ingredients for herbicides introduced in the market for 30 years. In other words, the corporations that are dominating in the agricultural input sector, it's just too expensive and not profitable for them to put any effort into designing or developing alternative weed control technologies. So they've been relying on this, fallback on this one technology, but it's increasingly becoming more and more problematic. And this kind of narrowing of innovation is drawing resources away from alternative kinds of technologies. A third big implication is that corporate consolidation exacerbates inequities in the system, and it's creating what scholars call a price squeeze for both producers and consumers. And research basically shows that as market power increases among firms, it gives them the ability to raise prices without improving the quality of the product or the services that they're delivering. So it's basically a transfer of wealth from consumers directly to the firms, because they're not getting anything more out of it when those prices go up. But at the same time, those corporations that buy from suppliers, independent suppliers, are able to control prices as well, and they push the prices down that they're willing to pay to those suppliers. And that was mentioned in the film just now. And that's a squeeze on small scale producers. And the graphic I put on the slide here is simply showing that in the US for corn and soy seeds, the prices increased by 3 times as a percentage of the production value per acre. And as you'll notice, the green line is wheat, and that's not happening in wheat. And the reason it's not happening in wheat is that wheat is not controlled by the big corporations. It's not a genetically modified crop. It's not under patent protection, and prices have been much lower. So it's really a good comparison to show the extent to which when corporations control certain seeds, they really can raise those prices. And that's putting a squeeze on the producers. As was already mentioned earlier when in Sarah's comments, the consolidation also concentrates risk. And we've seen this so starkly just this week with the closure of a number of meat plants. There was another one, I think just today, a pork plant in, I think it was Waterloo, Iowa, the other Waterloo. And there's one in, just south of Calgary in Canada, a Cargill plant, and the Smithfield plant in Idaho. The closure of these plants due to the spread of the COVID-19 among the workers has really exposed the rigidity of supply chains and has really led to huge disruptions in the meat supply chain in North America right now. So that simple concentration of risk because of that consolidation. And then finally, the last implication I'll mention here is that consolidation also tends to undermine democracy and reinforces the political power of the corporate elite. When we have fewer firms dominating in the sector, they don't have to compete to get the ear of the politicians that they're trying to lobby. They actually get more lobby power and it costs them less when there are fewer firms in the marketplace. And so these firms have been able to lobby very strongly on issues that matter for their bottom line. And as you'll see in the graphic there, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying politicians every year. Now, last slide. What are the lessons? And I know we're going to pivot now and talk about some of the lessons and things that can be done. But I just want to say that what's really been driving my own work in this area is that it's when we look at this corporate consolidation and this corporate concentration, it becomes clear that small scale producers cannot just ignore this big picture of these big corporations, because it has a direct implication for their own ability to have a stable and secure livelihood. It's important that in addition to seeking out alternative markets and alternative supply chains, that we must look to strengthen antitrust legislation. It needs to be strengthened and it needs to be implemented. There's actually it's called a new Brandeis movement among some scholars and policymakers who are trying to bring back the ideas of Brandeis to make market structure more central in antitrust policy. But there are a host of other things that need to be done. There need to be stronger financial regulation to prevent institutional investors from driving these kind of mergers and acquisitions in the sector. We need stronger public investment in research in alternative technologies, and also stronger public investment in the development of alternative supply chains. And we need to focus more on building a diverse and resilient network of food suppliers rather than concentrating everything in the hands of just a few corporations. So I will stop there.
Great, thank you so much. That was such a good, succinct summary of a complicated situation. And again, we'll be making the webinar recording available, and hopefully we could make even Dr. Clapp's slides available to folks. We've got a number of questions in the question and answer box. If you do have a question, please, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon. You can click on that and type in your question. So I'm just going to start asking some questions. So one person asked, I understand that much of globalization of food consolidation happened when the Bretton Woods Agreement failed in 1971. I guess if you can speak to that, and you've talked a little bit about what we need to do to fix it. What's the relationship with the Bretton Woods and the consolidation that we see?
That's an interesting question, and I mean, it's a complicated question. Like the failure of the Bretton Woods Agreement had a large amount to do with moving from a fixed exchange rate system to a floating exchange rate system, which, I mean, I have to think that through. I'm not sure I have an easy answer for why that led to consolidation, but I think it certainly would have given different kinds of incentives to multinational corporations in terms of their global scope. And it's true that in the 1980s in particular, we really saw the globalization of transnational corporations in the agri-food sector around the world, and the sort of rise of the corporatization of the, what we call the global food regime really began in that period. But in the 1970s, when the Bretton Woods Agreement failed, that was just a few years before the 1970s food crisis, when we saw all kinds of crazy stuff going on that was in many ways repeated in 2008, when we saw speculation on commodity markets and export restrictions and soaring food prices and crazy oil prices, et cetera. So it was really the decline of the Bretton Woods Agreement was really the beginning of chaos in the global economy that sparked a lot of these kind of disruptions.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Frankie. I've heard that one of the reasons that Monsanto wanted to be purchased by another company was to relieve them of their responsibility for the lawsuits related to Roundup. How true is that?
Oh, that's another good question. I'm not sure because I'm not researching specifically the lawsuits at the moment. But from what I understand, I mean, at least the cases that were that had been ruled on were after the deal had actually taken place of Bayer purchasing Monsanto. But I don't know when those lawsuits were actually filed, and perhaps they were filed earlier. But in a sense, even in 2014, it was mostly in 2014, Monsanto was actually already looking to buy another agri-food player, and instead of being bought, they wanted to buy another, and they were looking quite seriously at buying Syngenta, but that deal didn't go through. And in the end, Syngenta was purchased by ChemChina, and then Bayer ended up buying Monsanto. So I don't know about the accuracy of Monsanto wanting to be bought in order to get rid of its liability, and in the end, I mean, Bayer is going to be liable for those costs for sure.
You talked a little bit about the Borkification of the antitrust laws, and someone asked about, you know, because it's become all about the consumer and not all about the supply chain, are there some specific places to start in like rebuilding the precedent towards the supply chain competitiveness rather than just consumer price?
Yeah, well, that's where this neo-Brandeis movement is really interesting, because it's trying to go back to those basic principles. What's interesting about the Borkification of antitrust is that, in a way, he was trying to make antitrust less political by using economic indicators to determine when mergers should be allowed and when they shouldn't. It's like, to be an antitrust lawyer, you have to have almost a PhD in economics nowadays. Whereas in the old days, in Brandeis's time, he was really concerned about the political power of these firms, and antitrust decisions were very political. And so the question is whether as a society, we can move back towards making these decisions based on politics as opposed to simply basing them on economics. And that's kind of what the Neo-Brandeis movement is trying to do, is to raise awareness of the extent to which corporate consolidation is increasing inequality, dampening innovation, leading to higher prices, freezing out livelihoods for small-scale producers, et cetera. All of these consequences are really important, and they should be part of a public discussion in society more broadly, as opposed to making these decisions simply based on some algorithm. It may be less political, but in fact, all algorithms and all markets are regulated. Like they are. We have rules. And so those are political decisions that are perhaps less visible, but they're still political. And I think we need to have that conversation.
Great. We've had a couple questions about the role of attorney generals. I don't know if you can speak to what you know of the US system, of what state attorneys general can do in this fight.
Well, yeah, it's a good question, but I'm not sure I can speak to the role of state attorney generals, given that I'm based in Canada, and I haven't been following it at the governor and the state attorney general level. I'm sorry, maybe someone else on the panel here has some insights.
Yeah, and we, for folks to know, Wisconsin Farmers Union keeps in close conversation with our attorney general here in Wisconsin, and certainly encourages attorneys general they can join suits, they can start lawsuits, and a lot of times they maybe don't think they have the resources to do that. So I think, making sure that our states are properly resourcing the Attorney General's office so that they can take up these fights. It is within their power. And even as was mentioned in the film, even counties could start acting in this way. I think we're more used to looking at the Attorney Generals in the states and then looking up to the federal government. But, we can certainly work with our members to think through the specific things that our Attorney General can do, but we are in close conversation with them. Here we've got someone asking, as the corporate base grows, how can we shift the trend as smaller farmers? You mentioned it a little bit of why we have to, as farmers, pay attention to these structural issues, because it isn't just about us tightening our belt a little bit more. So I guess, what would be your advice as a group of small farmers?
Well, I think obviously what you're doing tonight with this webinar is extremely important, is raising public awareness of these issues. Oftentimes when we've got these big structural problems, they sort of fade in a way that they structure everything, but we don't always see that those structures are very powerful and how they're affecting people's everyday lives. And I think making that visible for average people, people who are not farmers, who are purchasing food at the supermarket, and they don't necessarily recognize the complexity of these issues when they purchase something at the store. And I think it's really important to bring that forward. Other things that small farmers can do in addition to raising awareness through education is to, lobby, as you're doing with your state attorney general. I think that's great. I think it's really important to get your voice heard, and to enter into some of these lawsuits when they need to. When competition is unfair, it needs to be taken up, as opposed to just getting out of the system. It's important to fight for the right to a decent livelihood.
Thanks. We've got another question from Garrett here. We've seen the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, the collapse of the giant middleman plants could be opening up new and more direct decentralized supply chains. So, what do you see when this sudden closure of all these plants, what is the opportunity for more direct decentralized supply chains? That's the first question. And then the second one in that phrase was, are farm gate price floors a way to empower growers? So I guess I'll let you answer those two how you like.
Well, I think, as the questioner noted, the COVID-19 really has revealed a lot of the rigidities and fragilities in supply chains right now, and I think in a really stark way. And I think the crisis could potentially be a moment to really call for a different way of organizing the food system. And I think it's really taken a lot of people by surprise, which is really interesting for those of us who study food and agriculture all the time to be like, okay, great. Everybody's aware of the role of migrant labor in the food system suddenly, and everyone's aware that supply chains are concentrated and rigid. That's good, because people then are going to be more open to thinking about different ways to organize. I think what needs to happen is we need to have denser production and supply networks. They need to be more diverse in order to be resilient. I mean, the whole literature around complex systems, we often talk about efficiency versus resiliency, and we need to move away from that excessive focus on efficiency and more towards resiliency. And that means we need to add in elements of redundancy, and redundancy not in a bad sense, but like more and more suppliers. And this was articulated very well in the video about needing multiple buyers and multiple sellers in order to avoid being pushed around by the big corporate players. So I think denser supply chain networks need to happen. What's great is that, as I said, as people are increasingly aware of this, and in my community, people are seeking out food, for example, not from supermarkets. They're scared to go to the supermarket right now, and they're going to the farm gate. And it's really bringing farmers and consumers closer together in new ways that I think are going to be long lasting. I don't think people are going to just go back to buying things at the supermarket. I think that these kind of new relationships are really, really important for people.
Great. We've had a couple of questions about cooperatives. So, many of us are members of lots of cooperatives, and our co-ops have been getting bigger and bigger and merging. And the promise of the co-op was to allow farmers to have power through collaborative action, but now we kind of feel like some of our co-ops do not really have our best interest in mind. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to the rise of the mega co-op and what that means.
Well, that's a really interesting dynamic. And I have to say, I haven't researched the co-op movement specifically, but it's interesting because we see a similar thing going on here in Canada, for example, with credit unions that are supposed to be local, credit suppliers, and they keep merging and getting bigger. So it's a similar kind of thing going on where the sentiment is in the right place, but sometimes they have to get bigger in order to basically stay viable in a context where they have to compete with bigger and bigger corporate players. I think that if we can move away from those big corporate players by enforcing antitrust in a better way, that it will create opportunities for co-ops to operate on a more local scale. Just like I think, if we can stop the big banks from controlling everything, that would open more space for local credit providers as well. And I think, that's important. Like the whole notion of finance for agriculture is really, really important. And it can come from more directly through social finance initiatives and things like that can be supported by governments. It could be supported by the state. It could be supported at the national level. And that's, I think, an important way to, instead of relying on these big giant investors like the BlackRocks, they control $7 trillion. It's crazy. why can't we instead bring direct contact between people who have, you know, savings they want to invest for their retirement directly into their own local community through food initiatives. And I think there's a lot of scope for that kind of direct social finance to really help redirect the sector in ways that are more resilient.
Great. We have time for one more question here, and I do apologize to everyone who asked questions that we didn't get to. We will have an inventory of all these questions and can certainly work to get more answers. But I think this is a good one. How can we work with Canadians and Europeans to strategically stand against consolidation?
Well, that's a great question, and I think maybe it's a moment to really link up farmers unions in different parts of the world to really be calling for these better antitrust rules and regulations. Already, the Europeans have been much more progressive than in North America with respect to competition policy, at least their fines of Google, and also they were much more skeptical of some of the big mega mergers in the agri-food sector. Yet at the same time, there was something like 5,000 letters written into the EU Commissioner on Competition regarding the Bayer-Monsanto merger. But she noted that that because the rules were written in a way that she had to look at them on economic grounds and not on environmental grounds or health grounds or any other kind of grounds, that her hands were tied. And I think that farmers unions can link up and collaborate and really make their voices heard about the importance of not just the consumer price impacts of mergers, but the livelihood impacts. I mean, we're talking about people's lives and livelihoods, and it's very important that instead of just thinking about prices and efficiency all the time, that we think about people's rights and their dignity as farmers.
Great, thanks. Again, sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. It's great we had up towards 110 folks participating during this time. We will make the recording available to everyone, but importantly, we have one last part of the program here. Bobby Wilson from the Wisconsin Farmers Union is going to wrap things up, and she's going to give us some call to action, some things that we can do. We've heard a lot of great ideas here tonight. Want to thank everyone for joining us, and we'll be following up with you, and please share this information with your friends, family, neighbors, your decision makers, and it's been great to have you. Thank you to Dr. Clapp for sharing your expertise with us. So I'll pass it to Bobby.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And I wanted to share my screen here so that you can see our page on our website where we have all of the information and resources that we can offer about monopoly power. So I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of action items or things that you can do following this presentation. And I first just want to recognize that right now we are in a moment where there is more public concern about monopoly power than at any other time in over a century. So not since the progressive era when we passed the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act have we seen so much attention focused on this control that large corporations have over our economy and our political system. So while we're not seeing adequate antitrust enforcement at the federal level, as we talked about earlier on the call, we have state attorneys general and we have private attorneys who are stepping up to block mergers and to challenge the legal precedent on antitrust, to recognize that it's not about consumer prices or efficiency, it's about having a fair, transparent, and competitive marketplace. So I also want to point out that discussions like this one are happening all over the country. They involve every sector of the economy, and that gives me so much hope for the future. I think that we will be able to create an economy that works for family farmers, for workers, for small businesses, and that really works for all of us. But I'll also say that it's not going to be easy. We really need all of you to get involved wherever and however you can. And I just wanted to share a few ways that you can do that. So this is Wisconsin Farmers Union's webpage on monopoly power. For anybody who is not viewing the screen right now, it's just wisconsinfarmersunion.com/monopoly power. And if you scroll down to the bottom here, you'll see this take action section that I want to draw your attention to now. So these are things that you can do right now to help move the needle on this issue. First and foremost, it's important to share your stories, to share how monopoly power impacts your life, your farm, your business. You can do that by writing opinion pieces, by doing media interviews. You can follow that link that Tommy mentioned earlier on the call that says seeking member voices so that you can be featured in one of these videos in the future. You can get involved with organizations that are tackling monopoly power. Wisconsin Farmers Union is working on this in agriculture, and there are a number of other organizations that are working on this as well. This is not a comprehensive list, but a couple of groups that we work with are Organization for Competitive Markets, Open Markets Institute, Family Farm Action, and the American Antitrust Institute. So you can follow them on social media and subscribe to their newsletters to get current information, and they also frequently send out action alerts on things that you can do, timely opportunities for you to make your voices heard on this issue. You can educate yourself about monopoly power. There are a number of great resources, and again, this is not a comprehensive list, but there's some books here for future reading. If you like what you read, you can start a book club with your friends and family and keep spreading the word about this. You can buy directly from farmers and from co-ops so that more of that money is going directly to the farmers. And of course, weigh in with your decision makers. Contact your members of Congress, the Department of Justice, your state attorney general, and let them know that you really want them to step up on antitrust and really help us create an economy that works for everybody. You can engage with candidates who are running for office before they're elected, attend their town halls, their forums, and ask them where they stand on these issues. And finally, we're in an election year, so make sure that you vote for candidates who support economic democracy. So these are just a number of the things that you can do. Please, I think everybody on this call can do at least one or two of these things, and it would make a huge difference and add to this growing movement that we're seeing. So I hope that you enjoyed the conversation today. I want to thank Dr. Clapp again for sharing this information and everybody for pulling together this great video. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you are not already connected with Wisconsin Farmers Union, you can visit the website and sign up as a member or join our email list, and we would love to have your involvement. So thanks everyone for being on tonight.